My name is Andrew Cheon, and I'm an assistant professor of international political economy. And my personal research is in energy and environment issues, as well as political economy more generally. And nowadays, I'm also studying international security. But enough about me. I'd like to move on to Secretary of State for Internationalization, Bernardo Ivo Cruz. And he brings with him today 30 years of professional experience, including financial services, government, public sector, private business, higher education, NGOs, and even working with international organizations. To my great pleasure, he has a PhD in political science. He's a practitioner with a PhD in political science from Bristol University in the UK. He received a degree in 2007. And he also graduated from Lusíada, I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, University in Lisbon back in 1995. And the degree was in international relations, which also is a great thing for me. I teach IR here. And just to go over some of his accomplishments, the list is quite long, but I've selected 5 that showcase the diversity of his experience, professional experience. First, as we all know, he's the Secretary of State for International Trade and Foreign Investment. I consider that sort of the equivalent of international political economy, which is what I study, but he actually has power, which I do not. He's also the advisor on Portugal's permanent representation in the European Union during the Portuguese presidency of the Council of Europe in 2021. He was also the executive board member of SOFID. In respect for Portuguese people, I will not try to unpack that particular acronym, but it's a limited liability company owned by the state, 80% ownership, specializing in sustainable development, which is part of the topic we'll be discussing today. He's also the elected member of the Court of Bristol University. I just wanted to highlight sort of his involvement in academia as well. Court of Bristol University, a member of scientific and pedagogical boards of the University of Cardiff School of European Studies. And finally, he's the member of the Strategic Board for International Relations at CIP, a Portuguese corporate confederation. So his experience really covers academia as well as private sector, public sector, international organizations, NGOs, and it's quite impressive. With that, without much further ado, I will pass the mic on to Secretary of State Cruz for opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'll speak from here. Let me start by thanking Professor Andrew, thanking the Dean for the kind invitation, and everyone here in this room for spending this hour with a conversation, which I hope it will be interesting, on environmental, climate change and governance. And I'm going to address the topic in 4 very short parts. To then we move to the interesting bit, which is the conversation between all of us. I'm going to start by highlighting the development of the idea of climate change and how the international organizations, the international community, in particular the UN, address the issue. Then I'm going to look at how developed countries are looking at climate change, then a couple of notes on the way that developing countries are considering the same issue, and the role of civil society organizations and private sector. So let me start by the very beginning. The first time the UN spoke about climate change, it wasn't yet climate change, it was the way that the member states were using natural resources was in 1949. So very shortly after the creation of the United Nations, we had the first sign from the international community that there was something that we should take care of or should look at in terms of the use of natural resources. Fast forward to 1968, and the UN Economic and Social Council decided to set an international conference, the first international conference. Thereabouts, we were already talking about climate change in 1972 that held in Stockholm. And then in 1987, you had the Gro-Brundtland report on climate change, where for the first time we used the expression sustainable development. It was the first time that someone wrote down sustainable development as a key or a goal for the international community. And 2 years later, in 1 year later, actually, it was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up. So by the end of the 80s, we had all the instruments, and we have all the scientific approach to study climate change and to understand climate change. And by that time, it was clear for science that climate was changing and that human action was having an impact on climate. So what happens after that? We knew by the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, that we were changing climate. We were impacting on climate. Science was telling us that. And then we spent 30 years debating if science was science. There was lots of conspiracy theories. There was lots of, oh no, this is some people trying to make money, or this is the planet adapting itself naturally to conditions. But the truth was that science was science, and science was right. And climate was changing. Well, I don't have to tell in this room something that I sometimes say in other rooms, which is, I'm sorry to say that science couldn't care less about what you believe. Science is science, and it tells us what it is. And the only way to change science is with more science. So if you don't agree with science, too bad. That's your problem, not science's problem. And science was telling us long before this that we need to change the way that we were getting our business done. 150 years of business based on the use of energy from non-renewable sources. Unfortunately, we wasted 35 years on this debate. We wasted 35 years on arguing if science was science. And when we finally come to the realization that actually it was science, and we knew that 35 years before, we now have very little time, we have a very short window of time to actually address the issue of climate change. Let me tell you two stories that happened in the last week. I was in Manila for the meeting of the Asian Development Bank a week ago. And we all heard in absolute silence the testimony of the governor of the Bank of Pakistan on what's going on in Pakistan. And he told us that it rained in the last period 17,000% more than the average of the last 30 years of rain in Pakistan. 17,000% more. He told us that 33 million people lost their houses because of the rain. He told us that the crops in the country were destroyed, infrastructure were destroyed, and they have no idea what lies beneath the water or how they're going to rebuild Pakistan. And he was heard in absolute silence. You could hear a fly flying around the room. And for the first time in 55 years, or at least the memory, the collective memory of meetings of the Asian Development Bank, when he stopped, there was a round of applause in the room. It was the first time there was a demonstration of emotion in the meetings, on the 55 years of meetings of the Asian Development Bank. On the other side of the world, in Europe and here in North America, we are witnessing a long and very dangerous drought. It rains less here and in Europe, in average, that it rained for the last 300 years, or at least as long as we know. So science is science. How are we going to address this? How are we addressing this? After wasting 35 years on a futile and frankly, to be absolutely honest, less than intelligent debate, not to use some other equivalent. How are we going to address this? So let me talk first how the developed world is looking at this. And let me tell you at the beginning three things. The UN agenda, the 2030 agenda on sustainable development of the United Nations, the European agenda, the 2030 European agenda called the for 55, and I'll explain a bit what that's all about, and the African Union agenda called the 2063 Development Agenda of the African Union countries. They all address climate change. So there is an understanding at the UN level, at Europe level, European Union level, and African Union level, that climate change is something that you need to address. Now the question is how to do it in the short period of time that we have to do it. In Europe, and let me use Europe as an example for the way that the developing countries are approaching this. We are starting from recognizing science, finally, and there are three major impacts on the recognition that climate change is a scientific fact. The first one is in terms of legislation. So the law has been changed at European Union level and at European member states to make sure that we address what we could have done in 35 years in the next 12 years to try to sustain the impact of climate change. So the European Union member states, the 27 countries in Europe that are part of the European Union, have now until 2030, to cut 50% of all emissions that have impact on climate change, and by 2050 to be climate change neutral in terms of emission. So you have to cut in 7 years half of everything that you produce that impacts on climate, and then you have another period of time to have it and to have it absolutely neutral emissions in terms of economic. That means that you have to change 150 years of the way of doing business in a couple of years. And that impacts on countries, impacts on businesses, impacts on families, impacts on organizations, impacts on you and I and everybody. It's a massive change that we have to produce and to put in place. The second big impact that science being science has in Europe is in terms of financing or access to financing. Every member state of the European Union, because of the European Central Bank and because of the national central banks, now have, if you want to have access to finance for businesses, you have to demonstrate that your business is climate neutral, or even better, it improves carbon emission and capture of carbon emission. So you will not find financing for projects or businesses that are not climate change friendly. And that applies to the public funding, but also to private funding and every source of funding that is regulated by central banks or other regulators in the financial services. And the way that they test this, and the way that they made, if you want, they taught banks that this change was necessary, was the Italian central bank. I must be honest with you, I heard this story, I couldn't confirm, but it's such a good story, let's take it for face value. The Italian central bank asked the banks in Venice to assess impact on the rising of water, 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, and 4 meters. And apparently the story goes, in 2 meters, the investment of banks in real estate was literally underwater in Venice. So the banking system is also falling in line with what science tells us that we need to do. So you cannot do by law, and you cannot do it because you will not find a ways of financing anything that is not climate, at least neutral, ideally climate, a positive impact on climate. And the third big change, and a change that comes not from governance or from legislation, is the way that the market itself is perceiving climate change in developed countries. More and more consumers are demanding to know where do the products or services come from, how were they obtained, how were they produced, what impact would they have on climate. And even the most traditional businesses are now having to adapt to this. We had, before I came to office, we were working with cattle producers in south of Portugal to make sure that the cattle production was environmentally friendly and animal friendly. And that was, when we first start talking with the cattle producers, they look at us as if we were just joking that everybody will keep eating beef, so we don't need to do anything. A few years later, not that many years later, they came to us and said, we need help, because 10% of the Portuguese population had turned vegetarian due to climate change impact of cattle. So we set up a program that involved universities, local governments, the cattle association, and markets, to make sure that what they were putting in the market was both animal welfare friendly and climate change friendly. So this is how developed countries are approaching the issue. They recognize that science is science, finally, and they put in place legislation, control over financing of projects, and the market itself, consumers, are taking their part and doing their business. So now let's move to the African Union. The African Union, as I said at the beginning, recognizes, as well as the United Nations and the European Union, that climate change is an issue, is a serious issue, and has to be dealt with. But the conditions in Africa are different than the conditions in Europe. On one hand, Africa is responsible for, the whole of the continent, is responsible for 4% of climate change impact, only 4%. On the other hand, as we in Europe go through a winter of demographics, there are less and less of us, and we are getting older and older. The same is not true in Africa. The average population in Africa ranges between 15 and 20 years old. So you have enormous number of young people who obviously are entitled to a bright future and a good future. And we need to tackle climate change in developing countries, taking these two things in consideration. One, their impact on climate change is substantially smaller than the developed world. And secondly, there's a social and economic dimension that we need to take care and to consider when dealing with climate change in developing countries. We all need to deal with climate change. There's no country in the world that cannot act on climate change, because climate change does not stop on the border of some country and say, not here because they have had no impact historically on what's going on. Sorry to say, is everybody on the same boat and everybody has to roll in the same direction. But the way that we do this, we need to make sure that is not the impact on the social and economic development of developing countries is not in such a way that will destroy the capacity of creating the jobs that we need to create, the economic growth that we need to create in developing world. So we need to work together. The European Union recognizes this and put together a significant fund, it's called the Fair Transition Fund, which deals with transitions in Europe and elsewhere. But we need to work with our partners in the African Union to make sure that we do the transition, what science tells us that we need to do, but we do it without jeopardizing the capacity of these countries to generate the wealth and the social development that they are entitled to, like everybody is entitled to. Third aspect that I would like to comment is the role of businesses and civil society organizations. Businesses are changing as the market is changing. One thing that we can count on business is to do what the markets expect them to do. If not, they will disappear. Businesses need to make money to exist. And we need businesses to make money because the wealth that is generated by the private sector generates the jobs that pay the salaries that allow us to live our lives, that send our kids to school and not to work, that go to a doctor when we are not feeling well. All of that comes from generation of wealth. At the same time, we need to make sure that that wealth that is generated by the private sector is fairly spread in society. So we need economic growth, but at the same time we need social development. And businesses have a strong role to play in social development. On one hand, as I said, paying good salaries. On the other hand, paying their taxes, which allow governments to create the public policies that will address inequalities in societies that will always come about. So there's a role there's a connection between economic growth for private sector and public policies coming from the generation of wealth and collection of taxes. So the businesses, particularly in Europe, and allow me to use the example that I know better, are now falling into place regarding climate change. Some of them because they do have a social conscience, and others because the market is just driving them in that direction. If you do not buy goods and services of companies who are not following what science is telling us, those companies will simply disappear from the market. What we need to make sure, and in Europe we're working on that, is that the rules and regulations, the social, particular environmental and social rules and regulations that we apply in Europe, businesses will apply across the full supply chain, wherever it comes from. And there's a legislation coming out of the European Union we are expecting the legislation to be published for then to be negotiated. In the beginning of 2023, so in January next, that will tell businesses you are responsible for the full supply chain of your business. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Meaning the businesses that you hire directly and the businesses that those businesses will hire in second and third tiers. So you have to make sure, as a business owner, that the full supply chain complies with environmental and social regulations. And if that doesn't happen, your business will not be allowed to sell within the European Union market, the 450 really wealthy clients that they have there. It's one way of approaching this and making sure that the impact of climate change and social policies really triples down from Europe to elsewhere where the supply chains exist. The other thing that we are looking at and considering is the way that younger generation took climate change as the key element of their lives. I like to tell this story. My father was born in 1941. He remembers the end of the Second World War. And for my parents' generation, at least in Europe again, the European Union and the role of the European Union equals peace and stability, the end of wars in Europe. Until the invasion of Ukraine, we had almost 70 years of peace within Europe, which was the longest period of peace in history in Europe. So for my parents' generation, the European Union is something to do with peace and no war in Europe. For my generation, I was born in 1968, so I'm 54. The European Union equals the end of the Berlin Wall and freedom around Europe and around the world. I was alive, more than alive, when the Berlin Wall came down. I actually visited Berlin before that happened in '85. I had a German girlfriend, and when one has a German girlfriend, one goes to Germany to spend the summer, and we spend the summer crisscrossing Germany, West Germany, and then we end up in West Berlin, and we went to East Berlin. So we passed through to the Berlin Wall, and we visit the difference, the massive difference between the two sides of the city. So for my generation, European Union equals freedom and democracy. Now, as Andrew mentioned very kindly, I am by training and by heart a university lecturer. So every time I have a chance, I come to universities, and when I finish doing governing, I'll go back to university. My students, who are in their 20s, 20-somethings, 20, 25, 26, when you ask them what is the cause of their life, is climate change and social policies. Is to make sure that climate change is addressed and is recognized, and to make sure that there is social balance and social justice in society. So from peace to freedom to climate change and social development, that's where societies, at least in Europe, have been moving in the last 70 years. And I would stop here. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll look forward for our conversation from here on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for breaking down the challenge that we face globally, and also just bringing it home to us, explaining to us complex concepts in ways that we can think about how to wrap our heads around this problem and what steps may be necessary in order to potentially solve it. I prepared a few questions. I actually wasn't fully aware that we would be speaking only on climate change, so I had a whole range of questions, but I'll be selective, and here are a few that directly draw on climate issues. Despite the voluntary nature of ESG disclosures, Portugal has seen many major companies and business associations sign on to these initiatives. And I was wondering, how will the recently passed climate framework law that passed by your government influence these trends?
Well, thank you. It is true that businesses are adapting and incorporating SDGs in their business model, at least in Europe and in Portugal. And the reason why they're doing this is because legislation, the one that you mentioned, the climate framework legislation that was passed by the Portuguese government the beginning of this year, actually at the end of last year, and came into action at the beginning of this year, which is modeled in the EU Fit for 55 legislation. So you have to cut half of your emissions by 2030 and halve the emissions by 2050. And that is what Portuguese legislation now says. Now let me make here a small detour. To put into the framework the war in Ukraine, particularly the impact that the war in Ukraine is having in energy. We'll see, a very strong connection between Russian gas and Eastern Europe energy supply. And because of the war, that connection is now being discontinued. Which means that the next winter we will have to deal with the winter with much less energy that we used to have or we expected to have. The transition that the European Union imposed and negotiated in member states means that we were changing very quickly from non-renewable energies into renewable energies. And now the European Union, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs at the European Union, the other day said in the European Parliament, for the first time, we see science and geopolitics walking hand in hand. So you may watch for a period of time some reuse of non-sustainable energy in Europe, but that is assumed and understood to be just to make sure that we can face the winter without Russian gas. Portugal has made its energy transition a quarter of a century ago. Not because we were really clever and understanding climate change before of everybody, but because we knew that we don't have oil, gas, but we do have the sun, wind, and rivers and seas. So it makes economic sense for us to start our energy transition 25 years ago. And that's what we did. So today, around 70% of electricity in Portugal is produced by renewable energies, particularly wind and sun. And we are investing heavily in R&D to see how we can improve the use of tide waves to produce energy. So we are, Portugal, we are, on one hand, we never depended very much from Russia and energy. On the other hand, we are way ahead of the curve on the transition from non-renewables to renewable energies in Portugal. But the legislation that you mentioned, it's absolutely clear that although we are ahead of many other European Union member states and we don't depend on Russian gas, the gas that we use comes from Northern Africa and from here, from the US, we need to make that transition as well. It's not the case that because 70% of our electricity comes from renewables already, that we can not make the transition like everybody else. And the legislation is very clear. By 2030, you have to cut half of the emissions. By 2050, you have to cut all of them.
Portugal was among the first countries to actually sign up for the 2050 carbon neutrality goals, and it was also quite recently shut down its last remaining coal-fired power plant in November 2021. This had initially been the goal set for 2030, and so it seems like a promising sign in terms of reaching your targets. Could you tell us about the strongest political drivers of decarbonization in Portugal?
Well, I think there's a combination of drivers. There's one that is purely economic. It's much cheaper for Portugal to generate renewable energies than use other energies. Renewable energies, for us, once you have the structure in place, it's just there. The sun comes out in the morning and goes down in the evening. The wind flows from one place to the other. So you need to improve to make it better. But it is economically obvious that we should have done this transition. The other aspect is that we are now, and if you want to keep also in the economic side, we produce more renewable energy than we can consume. So we can become exporter of renewable energies. And we are working really, really hard in developing new sources of sustainable energy or renewable energy. We have massive investments in the south of Portugal on green hydrogen. For those of you who don't know the difference between green hydrogen and brown hydrogen, hydrogen is the water molecule that we split in oxygen and hydrogen. So H2O, the O is oxygen, the H2 is hydrogen. When you split that, the hydrogen that comes out of that, splitting that molecule, generates energy, can be used for energy. The splitting of the molecule, we need energy to do that. You have to input energy into the molecule to split the two atoms, the two parts of the molecule. And if you do that using renewable energy, that's green hydrogen. So you are not polluting on using polluting energy to create new energy. You are using renewable energy. That's what we do. We are producing green hydrogen. Hydrogen then can be used to move cars, to move planes. There's enormous science involved in this. I'm not a scientist. But it is believed that it could be one of the two possible solutions, or two or three possible solutions for a sustainable, cheap, and unending energy to the world. Because it comes from water. Water is there. You just need to split the molecule of water. As long as you do it in a sustainable way, that's fine. We're not there yet. There's more science to be done on how to use hydrogen, but we are moving really quickly there. So we are, because of economics, because of politics, we assumed and we incorporated the climate change policies, and because of remaining ahead of the curve, as we were 25 years ago, we are investing very heavily on our energy transition. The best we did so far was a week and a half on renewable electricity only, not using one atom of non-renewable electricity production. And that was the best that we managed to do. Let me give you another number that would illustrate the dimension of the process. Portugal, on the whole, in a summer day where everybody's working, air conditioners are on, everybody's using electricity, uses 9 to 10 gigawatts hour of energy. The whole investment that we are doing in green hydrogen in Sines, where all of this is taking place, means that Sines alone will consume 5 gigawatts hour of energy to produce the green hydrogen. So it's almost half it's more than half of the whole energy that Portugal consumes in a given day, in a given hour. And that is the size of the investment and the work that we're doing in generating enough green hydrogen for, we hope, that will become SAF, which is sustainable airline fuel, for cars, for, well, you mentioned, you think about it, and it's there. So yes, we are moving very quickly on that direction. We shut down the two coal plants that we had 2 years ahead of schedule. There were some noises about it. There were some noises now if we should reopen it because of the war in Russia, in Ukraine. But so far the decision has been made not to change that, to keep the plants closed. But of course we don't know what winter will bring, how long the war will last. We all living in very uncertain times. We were before the invasion, now we are even more. And so we will not say never again, but our commitment is to move to renewable energies and full-fledged renewable energies. We have decided by 2030 that we want to put another 10 gigawatts in offshore wind. So we are making everything we can to make that transition.
Thank you very much. Just to make sure that people in the audience will have a chance to ask questions as well, I think we should move on to the Q&A portion.
Hello, my name is Cheon, and it's a great honor to meet you in this place. I have one question about hydrogen energy in Portugal. So last summer, I was in Portugal for 1 month, and I was able to see lots of electric cars there. But is there any hydrogen-powered car there? Because I haven't seen any of hydrogen-powered car. But as I hear, like Portugal is one of the like developed in hydrogen power. I'm just wondering if there's any plan or like subsidy for hydrogen cars. I think it's more competitive for Portugal. Thank you.
Should I answer each question at a time, or it's fine? So thank you so much. I'm very happy that you've been to Portugal. I hope you enjoyed it. Well, you spent a month there, so I'm sure you enjoyed it. Science is not completely clear where electric mobility is going to. You are, most of you, too young to remember beta and VHS in videos. But I was around that time, and there was this massive debate. Should we use beta? Should you use VHS? videos, and the two technologies were next to each other, hand in hand. And then one fine day, someone decided that VHS was better than beta, and beta disappeared. That's more or less where we are with electric or power banks, batteries or power banks for cars. Batteries is when you plug your car into the wall and you charge the battery of your car and off you go. Power banks is you put a gas or a fuel in your car, and the power banks will transform that fuel into energy. So it's completely sustainable. It's electric cars as well, but it's a different system. And we don't know yet where science will tell us to go. If batteries, which is now at the moment as we speak the most proeminent technology, or if we will move to fuel cells. We are looking, in Portugal, we're looking at both technologies, and we are considering both technologies. There's advantage and disadvantage in either technology, but I think we've been prudent not to make a decision to go full-fledged in one direction without knowing where the market and the technology will take us in science. But you are right, car manufacturers are betting very heavily in batteries and not fuel cells. The difference has to do with the capacity of the fuel cells are really good for long journeys. So here in the US, you would see fuel cells in trucks that crisscross the country from one place to the other, because you don't need to spend lots of time to recharge that. You just go to a pump station, you pump whatever sustainable fuel is there, and the fuel cell will transform that into electricity. Batteries you need to plug, wait a few hours, so it's less efficient in that way. But on the other hand, the way that batteries work are more efficient than fuel cells. So probably we'll end up with both, some of them for cars, some of them for trucks and long hauls. But we don't know where we're going to be yet, so we are not putting our money completely in one way and not the other. But we are following what the car manufacturers are doing, which is basically everybody who has an electric car has a battery car. And you will find battery socks on the walls and not hydrogen or other fuels for fuel cells.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm curious how Portugal can get bigger countries to be more on board with fighting climate change. It seems like the European Union is very good about doing that, but how can we get the United States more consistently working towards climate change? How does the Inflation Reduction Act impact that? And how can you continue to get the United States on board depending on who's in office?
Well, I'm not going to comment too much in internal American politics, if you don't mind. The chief of staff of the minister is sitting on the back, and he will not be happy if I would enter into a long debate on American politics. Let me just say this. We need everybody on board. And we recognize there are arguments in developing countries that we need to take into consideration. We need to recognize that they are not as polluting as developed countries, not at all. We need to recognize that we did our social development and transformations ages ago, and some countries still need to provide for their citizens. All of that we need to recognize. But we need also to not forget that science is science, and climate change is there. So we need to find ways of working with developing countries to help the transitions, to make sure that everybody does what we need everybody to do, not sacrificing generations of people in this process. So we need to have everybody around the table. Big countries, small countries. If you go to Asia, you will find small island states that are simply disappearing. Tonga, Malau, Tonga, you know them. Kiribati, and lots of small island states in the Pacific, who year after year after year are getting smaller because the sea is getting higher. So it's not just Europe and US. Is Europe and US, is the African Union, is China, Russia once it gets back to the concert of nations as well. But developing countries, everybody has to come to this agenda, recognizing that not everybody is in the same position, recognizing that not everybody can do the same thing at the same time, and recognizing that some countries need help and some other countries have to help. But we cannot have large countries or medium countries, for that matter, not engage into climate change agenda. We need to understand what is different, we need to take on board what is different, but we need to work with everybody. And the US is a major country in the world, and we're very happy to see that the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement on climate change, and is engaging at the UN and other international forums on the issues of climate change, because we need everybody: China, US, Canada, Brazil. We all have to come to terms with the fact that science is science. Like I said at the beginning, very sorry if you don't believe in science. I couldn't care less about what you believe. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Portuguese.
Oh, hello.
Boa tarde. No, I'm very interested because I work in transportation and everybody talks about transportation, obviously. I've been working there for 20 years and I work in developing or emerging economies and developed countries. And to be honest, I'm always very disappointed when I do a project in Africa and I always have to prove that, for instance, a road, it needs to be climate adaptation, climate mitigation, it needs to be everything. And then I've worked in Europe and it can be pretty much still a bit of everything. But so my question is a bit different from that. I believe, I'm a firm believer in leading by example. So as I said, I'm still a bit disappointed about the developed countries doing more. And what I'm interested in, we talk a lot about generating energy. We talk a lot about electric vehicles. Why, or should we do more, I believe we should do more about demand management, meaning
Sorry?
Demand management.
Okay, yes.
Meaning, okay, we talk about replacing not sustainable sources with sustainable sources. Why don't we do less? Meaning, why don't we consume less? And in transportation, that means, why don't we have less cars on the streets? Honestly, I don't care too much if they are electric. I really would like to see less cars. And I'm talking, of course, about developed countries, because in Africa, we want to see more cars. So, thank you.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. It's not easy to answer. Let me just add another dimension to our discussion, which is democracy. Democracy is a system of government that is based in consent, sorry, my English escaped me, in consensus, which means that the way that we frame democracy nowadays, representative democracy, we vote for some people that will represent us, better or worse, and will speak for us. So the system is based on the idea that you trust someone to speak for you. And if you don't vote, please do, because if you don't, someone else will. And your ideas will not be part of the national conversation or the international conversation. No matter where you vote, just go there and vote. Actually, it matters who you vote for, but vote. Now, because democracies are the system, with all the failures and all the problems and all the difficulties, there's no human system that is perfect and works really, really well as we imagine it. We cannot create the conditions, even if we think that we should because of the urgency of climate change. we cannot create the conditions that will alienate the voters or the population, that we would remove that trust from I vote in someone because I trust them to do whatever I think is better for our society. So we cannot break the trust bond between the electorate and the governments and parliaments. It's not always there, no, I see your face. It's not perfect, but it's the best that we managed to come out with. There's no other... Churchill has this quoted every day, millions of times, that democracy is the worst system apart from everything else. And it is. It's the best that we could collectively come out with. Is the system that, no matter what, is the one that provides for more freedom, but also provides for a structure in society. If you have full freedom, it would mean that the strong would just eat the weak. So you need some structure in society to protect those who need protection. But at the same time, you cannot protect people in such a way that they will not be able to do whatever they feel they should do. So the whole thing is balanced. It's balanced between individual freedom and social rights. So my freedom cannot impose on your social rights, but your social rights should not diminish my freedom. So we need to find the balance here. It's balanced between what we think we want and what the majority of the population think they want. It's very rare that I vote in the majority. It happened very few times in my lifetime. But even when I lose elections, in the sense that I vote for someone who was not elected, I know that the system is designed in a way that my rights and my opinion is heard and considered. So we cannot split, because for good reasons, even for good reasons, we cannot make the changes so quickly and so profound that society will not be able to follow us or to accept where we want to go, running the risk of, at some point, you lose the quality of trust that you need to run an organized and free, at the same time, society. So I understand what you're saying, and I don't know. I hope nobody's from fashion in this room. Fashion is one of the most polluting industries in the world, because fashion is based on you use today, and then you buy something new, and next fall there's something new that you should buy, and we need to change that, but we cannot change it in such a way that it breaks the connection between those who make decisions in our names and those who we vote for. So we need to balance that, not to go too quickly, even if we're going in the right direction. One of the issues that happened in many countries is that people lost trust in democracy and starting voting for those who would say democracy is useless or democracy doesn't work, or etc., etc., etc. And when that happened, we then saw the results of that. So we need to change. I agree with you, but we need to change in a way that we will not break this trust between elected and elected people. I don't know if I...
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Manuel from Georgetown University, also a Luso descendant. So, and my grandparents, I go back as often as I can. I appreciate your wonderful presentation, very interesting. I haven't thought about beta and VHS for a long time. I believe at the time beta was the American technology, but the Japanese came up with VHS and it was a better product. So, and now we don't have any of it, but yes, at the time. I was particularly interested in your discussion about European investment combating the problems of climate change in Africa. And my concern is, or my question, deals with the issue of soil erosion. So we know that most of our food stuff, the seeds, come from the soil in Africa. Around the world it's been cloned. But the originals are in Africa. So with climate change, it will eventually threaten the global food supply. I'm wondering if you could speak to that, what investments are being taken, taking place, and what can be done to help stop that process?
Thank you. Well, I'm not an expert on food, so forgive me if I say something that it's not accurate. But the whole process has to be integrated, and soil erosion and food supply. We are now, because of the war in Ukraine, suddenly we all talking about food security again, as if there wasn't food insecurity across the world as it is. But it became a topic again. I'm not completely confident on the science of soil erosion or food security. What I can tell you is we need to manage, and maybe coming back to the previous question, we need to manage everything much better than we do. And we need to learn how to manage things much better than we do. One of the issues that we're facing is fresh water. Fresh water is key for everything, to life. And yet there's issues on fresh water. You have two combined policies that you could implement, and I'm using fresh water as a metaphor for the whole system. You can I don't know how to say this word. Is to take the salt out of seawater. Desalinization. It always I always mix some vowels here, but that's one thing. And that's you put some machines near the ocean, and it will take the salt of the water, and the water becomes fresh water. That's fine. But at the same time, we need to understand how to manage fresh water. And there are really good cases around the world of public policies for managing fresh water. The two that I find that is more effective, it's Australia and Israel. They are the two countries that I know of that are more effective in managing fresh water, probably because they don't have them enough. So in Israel, for instance, the same drop of water is used 4 times in the cycle of using water, which means that you can, you need to, I would argue that the same is true for food. You need better management policies, and you need to work with the countries that would benefit from cooperation and development to understand how we can improve food production and food security across the planet. I don't think there is lack of food. I would argue that there is lack of proper distribution of food, which are two different things. But we need at the same time, we cannot, if we want to be serious about climate change, for instance, and other arguments that we can use, we should not try to create these massive structures of moving food and stuff around. You should try to grow as close of the consumer as possible. So we need to come together and understand where we can improve food production, where we can make it more efficient, where we can produce more and better, and that is part of developing policies, helping countries that need help to make that transition. Europe knows very well how to do that. When the first common policy of the European Union was common agricultural policy. And the reason is historical. After the Second World War, there was starvation in Europe. So you need to build the capacity to feed everybody. Europe was very effective on that. So we know how to do it. There's knowledge there, and we just need to improve. And this just is enormous. Just you need to improve on our cooperation policies and to work with other countries to make sure that happens, and to guarantee that food security is a reality for everybody, which is probably the most basic human right after life. Then you have is food security. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think there was a question here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm jumping the gun. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Secretary. It's an honor to meet you. My
Thank
name
you.
is Sinan Qasim. I'm a first-year student, and I have visited Portugal. I had a wonderful experience. So, but my question is actually towards the climate goals that Portugal has. How civil society has helped in achieving those goals. I know, for example, the Aga Khan has established a seat of government in Portugal. So how the nonprofit sector and even the business community has rallied behind these objectives.
Thank you for your question, and thank you for visiting Portugal. I actually, you should all visit Portugal if you haven't go there for the first time. If you have, go again. But civil society is a key driver of climate change. Younger generations, as I mentioned earlier, at least in Europe, have two major policies that are engaging with climate change and social development. And as the younger generation becomes more prominent in the market, they are forcing change. Because if you are a business and you want to sell to your clients, you need to provide what our clients want. And as this generation becomes economically more integrated in the market, they are really making a change in the market. You will not put to sell something that either your young clients or the children of your clients are not inclined to buy. So you have, you see this in supermarkets a lot of time. Little children going, "No, mommy, no, daddy, I don't want to buy. You shouldn't buy that because I saw on Disney Channel or other channel that's not good for the environment." And they are very strong advocates of climate change and climate change policies. My nephew's generation, they are in the 30s now. They are 30 years old, both of them. And they are a completely different generation than I was. And the difference is not that much. 24 years of difference between us, me and them. They are much more. Let me tell you a story. It's probably easy. My nephew is now living with 4 friends. They rented a place together, and he called me the other day and said, "Oh, come and see my house." Oh, fine. So I went there, and he showed me his boiler, the hot water boiler. And he said, "This is really modern. It shuts down after 5 minutes, the hot water. So we can only have 5-minute showers, not to use more." And I thought, this is absolutely ridiculous, and it's completely crazy. But he was really keen and happy that his boiler would shut down the hot water after 5 minutes to make sure that there's some happy people there in the audience, that make sure that you could not take long showers like I like to take. And that is clients change in the market. You wouldn't have in my generation a boiler that would shut down. We would send it back immediately and demand for a proper boiler. But now the clients, my nephew's generation is demanding boilers that would shut down after 5 minutes to make sure that they are doing their bit and their role in climate change. And that changes the market. Now everybody who builds a boiler has, "Oh no, we need to add a 5-minute clock to this." And that's really interesting. And that, if you want, in a market economy, is what gives me the guarantee that we will move into climate change policies. Because more than the government, more than the regulator, it's the people who make the decisions and will go to the business and say, "I want to buy a boiler that will shut down the hot water in 5 minutes." And they will do it because that's their role. It's to provide the services and the goods. So I'm very, very comfortable with your generation in making sure that we get this right. I'm only sorry that my generation wasn't awakened enough 30 years ago to make sure that we get it right. And now you have to pay the price, which is we have to make the transitions much quicker than we could have done if we had paid any attention to science to begin with. Thank you so much. I'm looking at the dean's office, and she's very nice, but she's not happy. I would refer back to Andrew, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd just like to conclude with a couple of remarks. I won't be keeping you for too long. First of all, I think that I for one will be looking at Portugal with much interest, in particular from an academic perspective, although I may not be going on a trip anytime soon. I think a country that's been dependent, 76% of its primary energy supply depends on foreign imported fossil fuels. And just to see how that country has made strides in energy transition has been fascinating, and will continue and be cheering on the sidelines. And another thing I'd like to note is this type of engagement with academia is much appreciated. I think a lot of us, I grew up wanting to be a diplomat for one, and SAIS was my dream school. I'm not just minding my audience, but and so it's just a great experience to get to meet a policymaker, someone who's actually making impact, and also seeing how our theories and our academic formulations hold up in practice. And so thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who came here to join us. Thank you so much. Thank you.